It's an ordinary night on Broadway as theatergoers rush to their seats, eager to enjoy a timeless production of In the Heights. But for one man, the real drama isn't unfolding on stage. It's gripping him like a vice directly in his hands. The final draft of a 221-page prospectus delivered right before the show. That will result in Wall Street either catapulting his dreams into reality
So how do you win the game?
or shattering them against the rocks.
The stock market is opening in the red this morning after a rough finish last week on a weaker than expected jobs report.
The stakes? A staggering $4 billion and the validation he's longed for since he was a kid. As the actors on stage sing their final song, it's Stephen Schwartzman who prepares for the performance of his life. The story starts in 1947 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where Stephen Schwartzman was born into a middle-class Jewish family. His father, Joseph Schwartzman, owned a family business called Schwartzman's Curtains and Linens, where he sold, you guessed it, curtains and linens. It was here that young Stephen first dipped his toes into the business world. Sure, it wasn't quite Wall Street, but every financier has to start somewhere, right? Stephen was only 10 years old when he started working at the store, and earning 10 cents an hour wasn't exactly enough to earn him a title in Forbes magazine, yet. But it was clear from the start that Stephen was an ambitious young man who always wanted more when he asked his grandfather for a 150% raise. Of course, Grandpa Schwartzman turned him down. Stephen often messed up calculations on how much fabric was needed for drapes, so there was no way he was getting 25 cents an hour. But this didn't deter Stephen's drive. In fact, he saw a lot of potential for Schwartzman's curtains and linens. Young Stephen figured, why stop at selling fabric to the fine folks of Philly? Why not expand and have stores all over the country? Yet, when he brought the idea up to his father, Mr. Schwartzman was less than thrilled. Content with the humble life he'd built for himself, he had no desire to turn the shop into a chain. And while Stephen loved his dad, he couldn't have been more different from him in this regard. You'll see just what I mean by that later.
It was hard for me to imagine how a smart person wouldn't want to do that, because it was just right there.
But during his youth, Stephen would continue selling linen handkerchiefs to customers until it was time to go off to college. His first choice? The prestigious Harvard University, though it seems Stephen might have been dreaming a little too big. He was rejected. But what does a motivated dreamer like Schwartzman do? Calls up the director of admissions to warn him, you've made a mistake. But Harvard didn't yield, so Stephen was forced to settle for his second choice, Yale, another respectable Ivy League school with a discerning acceptance rate. Now in high school, Stephen had excelled in all his classes, even earning himself the title of student council president. But Stephen initially struggled during his time at Yale, and even had to seek out extra help from a trusted English professor. But don't feel too bad for our protagonist. It wasn't long before he was back on track, earning straight A's and a coveted spot on the dean's list. In 1969, Stephen graduated Yale with a degree in social sciences. Now you might be thinking, wait, social sciences? Why not finance? Well, Stephen had always enjoyed studying people, and he didn't know that one day he'd be the king of capital when he chose his major.
I didn't even take an economics course at Yale. I frankly wasn't much good with math.
In fact, it wasn't until after graduating that he took his first shaky steps into the world of finance. Stephen landed himself a gig at an investment banking firm called Donaldson, Lufkin & Jarrett. He was offered a $10,000 salary, but in true Schwartzman style, negotiated it up to $10,500. However, his time at this firm was relatively short. While Stephen enjoyed having an office with a beautiful view of Manhattan, he was discouraged by Wall Street's endless rules and regulations. One of his first tasks on the job was investigating a new chain of German-style sausage restaurants. Naturally, Schwartzman, with his insatiable appetite, dove in headfirst, visiting their headquarters and probing for relevant information. But his enthusiasm quickly turned to bewilderment when his boss reprimanded him for violating SEC regulations, a rule Stephen thought would have been nice to know in advance. At the time, Stephen thought to himself, Wall Street is crazy, and eventually quit DL&J to serve in the Army Reserves. But Schwartzman's time serving his country wouldn't last long. He had bigger plans in mind. After fulfilling the brief military obligation, Schwartzman, motivated by a desire to prove himself, decided to go back into the frenetic world of Wall Street. He applied to Harvard Business School once again. Only this time, he got in. And after graduating in 1972, Schwartzman wasted no time putting his education to practical use. That very same year, he joined Lehman Brothers, a highly prominent global investment firm where almost all the big-shot investors were employed at the time. But it was at this firm that Schwartzman would realize just how competitive the world of finance could be. Early on, for example, he wrote a detailed 68-page report complete with appendices and footnotes. But not long after submitting his work, he was stunned by an angry phone call from his superior, Herman Kahn. Herman criticized Schwartzman for one typo on page 56 before aggressively slamming down the phone.
And it sort of went like this. This is Herman Kahn calling. Is this Steve Schwarzman?
Needless to say, this made it clear there would be no room for mistakes if Schwartzman wanted to prove himself in the industry. So did he give up? No way. Schwartzman once said, "The resilience you exhibit in the face of adversity, rather than the adversity itself, will be what defines you as a person." In the next year, 1973, his luck started to change when Pete Peterson, you'll want to remember this name, became the CEO of Lehman Brothers.
He was a guy who was very smart, summa cum laude process thinking. I was quicker.
Peterson would work closely with Schwartzman and even save him from getting fired just 5 years later. The story behind that? In 1978, Schwartzman received a call from Ken Barnaby, CEO of Tropicana. The company was considering a buyout offer, and Barnaby wanted Schwartzman in Florida the very next day. So Schwartzman hopped on a plane and met with Barnaby at 7:30 a.m. the next morning. He quickly learned about Beatrice Foods' $488 million offer for Tropicana. Then, he had just 1 hour to prepare an analysis of 3 different payment structures before a big meeting. In the meeting, Schwartzman presented his recommendations to 5 board members, including Tropicana's founder. In the end, the board chose a mix of convertible, preferred, stock, and cash, and Schwartzman left for New York feeling like he pulled off the biggest win of his career yet. However, the following Monday, Schwartzman received an angry call from Peter Solomon, Lehman's vice chairman. Solomon claimed that he had been working on a deal to buy Tropicana and threatened to have Schwartzman fired. One anxious Schwartzman called up Pete Peterson to explain the situation and ask for help. Luckily, his mentor of half a decade saved the day, and Schwartzman was relieved to learn he wasn't getting the boot from Lehman Brothers just yet. But Schwartzman's tenure at Lehman Brothers, while successful, wasn't to last forever. The arrival of Lou Glucksman at Lehman sparked a power struggle between Lou and Pete. To avoid a civil war, Peterson made the difficult decision to leave, though this shift in leadership would have drastic consequences for the company. You see, under Glucksman's management, Lehman found itself in trouble. The situation became so severe that American Express actually stepped in to buy out the firm. Ironically, it was Schwartzman himself who helped facilitate this deal. With a family of his own to consider, Schwartzman decided it was time to move on from his career at Lehman Brothers. His departure marked the end of an era for both him and the company, but it would also mark a new beginning for him and his good friend Pete Peterson. As the curtain fell on Schwartzman's Lehman Brothers act, a new and even more ambitious production was about to begin. It all started in Peterson's East Hampton home, where Schwartzman and his former mentor began discussing the next chapter. Have you ever had an idea you just couldn't shake? Well, that's exactly what happened. It wasn't long before Schwartzman and Peterson began fantasizing about starting their own firm. The duo began holding daily meetings at the Mayfair Hotel's Courtyard restaurant. Over coffee and strategy sessions, they assessed their combined skills, experience, and reputations, the building blocks of what would be their future company. You see, their goal wasn't just to create another investment firm, but a lasting institution that would stand the test of time, unlike Lehman Brothers.
What we did is we sat around and said, okay, we're going to start a business. Let's start something unique.
Naming their brainchild was a challenge at first, but they ended up going with Blackstone, a clever nod to their surnames, Schwartz, meaning black in German, and Peters, son, translating to stone in Greek. With only $400,000 in starting capital, $200,000 each, they started Blackstone with a focus on private equity, a field they believed held great potential. So, where did these two first set up shop? Where else than the financial capital of the world? That's right, Blackstone had its humble beginnings in New York City, a modest 3,000 square feet in the Seagram building. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and more importantly, it was theirs. In this new venture, Schwartzman took on the role of CEO. It was the beginning of what would become one of the most significant chapters in his career, and indeed in the history of Wall Street. In 1985, Schwartzman and Peterson announced their company's arrival with a full-page ad in the New York Times. And just like that, Blackstone was born, a financial juggernaut in the making, ready to make waves on Wall Street for decades to come. But not so fast! The waves Schwartzman would make weren't immediate. Instead, we could better describe the firm's start as a slow trickle. You see, Schwartzman and Peterson soon realized that naming the company was one thing, but getting it off the ground was quite another. They needed money, which meant they needed other investors to get excited about Blackstone and invest in their dream. So how'd they do it? Well, there was no such thing as Twitter or social media marketing yet, so they had no choice but to do it the old-fashioned way. Schwartzman and Peterson sent out over 400 letters to their contacts, introducing their new firm with an enthusiasm of proud parents. But instead of a flood of business opportunities and investors begging to invest, they mostly received polite congratulations. And the jobs they did manage to land were hardly the stuff of Wall Street legend. The Squibb Beach Nut Company threw them a bone with a $50,000 advisory job, pocket change in the world of high finance. Armco, a steel company, providing another small gig. It was a start, but hardly the roaring takeoff Schwartzman and Peterson had envisioned. Undeterred, they set up 18 meetings with potential investors. Surely, they thought, once they got face-to-face with these financial bigwigs, the money would start rolling in and they could get Blackstone off the ground. But these meetings, including one with Delta Airlines, mostly ended in disappointment. It was becoming clear that building a financial empire wasn't going to be as easy as writing a clever company name on letterhead.
Small little companies like this were not successful in investment banking. In fact, they didn't exist at all.
But all that changed in 1987 when Schwartzman found himself face-to-face with Prudential Life's vice chairman. Their meeting resulted in Prudential Life taking a $100 million gamble on Blackstone, the moment they'd been waiting for. And wouldn't you know it, once Prudential opened its wallet, everyone else wanted a piece of the action too. With Blackstone's newfound clout, Schwartzman was ready to make his grand entrance into the big stage. And boy, did he pick a doozy for his debut. Blackstone's first big investment? None other than USX, formerly known as US Steel. You see, Schwartzman was aiming to snag a controlling 51% stake in this industrial giant, but this wasn't just any old purchase. He and his team were plotting a leveraged buyout, which meant they were planning to use borrowed money from a bank to finance the deal. But here's where things got tricky. Schwartzman found himself knocking on bank door after bank door, only to face rejection after rejection. Unfortunately for Schwartzman, banks during this time had some serious concern about the steel industry. For a moment, it seemed like Blackstone's luck was finally changing when JP Morgan showed interest, but their terms were, to put it nicely, less than satisfactory. This was too bad. Schwartzman was desperate for the validation of working with a big bank like JP. He knew how much street cred Blackstone could get by collaborating with one of the biggest names in the game. But he had another financial institution, Chemical Bank, on the line. And while they weren't as big as JP Morgan, they were willing to provide better terms and full underwriting. So, the man who'd once been rejected a 15-cent pay raise found himself rejecting one of the Wall Street's biggest banks. Sorry, JP Morgan. In the end, Blackstone took Chemical Bank's money and put up $13.4 million in equity, with a USX chipping in $125 million in vendor financing. It was a high-wire act, but Schwartzman was ready to put on a show. And what a show it was! Within 2 years, Blackstone had nearly quadrupled their equity, but that was just the opening act. By 2003, the total return would grow to 26 times their initial investment, a jaw-dropping 130% annual return. And just like that, Blackstone had announced their arrival on Wall Street with all the subtlety of a fireworks display. And from there on, Schwartzman lived happily ever after. Just kidding! You know what they say, you've got to kiss a few frogs before you find your prince. Or in this case, lose a few million before you make your billions. And this would become evident when Blackstone made its third biggest investment, and its biggest mistake yet, with a company called Edgecomb. Like Schwartzman's first deal, Edgecomb was in the steel business, and he was hoping that this buyout would be just as promising. But you have to understand, one good deal doesn't make you a stock market pro. In the early days, Blackstone was still finding its footing, and like a toddler learning to walk, the company had lots of enthusiasm but a lot less coordination. In fact, at this point, Schwartzman barely had any risk management processes in place, a mistake that would end up costing him big time. You see, as the price of steel went down, Blackstone took a huge hit on its Edgecomb investment. And as you can probably imagine, the aftermath wasn't pretty. In fact, Schwartzman got a call from an angry investor that would haunt him for years to come. The tongue lashing he received made his previous call with Herman at Lehman Brothers look like a love letter. And as this irate investor's words hit home, Schwartzman felt his face flush red, fighting back tears of frustration and embarrassment. But from this bitter experience came a valuable lesson and a sacred vow. He swore that he would never lose money in this fashion again. He even kept a makeshift tombstone of the failed deal on his desk for decades, a daily reminder of the costs of complacency. But here's the million-dollar question, or in this case, the billion-dollar question. Could Schwartzman keep that vow? Or would the cutthroat world of Wall Street chew him up and spit him out like so many before him? It's a big question to answer, and we'll get there. But first, let's talk about Schwartzman's next steps, finding Blackstone's bread and butter. That's right, it wasn't until the early 90s that Blackstone started investing in what would become the company's primary source of revenue, real estate.
We own, hundreds of billions of dollars of real estate.
So, what made Schwartzman, a man with no experience in real estate, get into buying property? Well, as he once said, to be successful, you have to put yourself in situations and places you have no right being in. And given the economic climate in the late 80s and early 90s, Schwartzman saw an opportunity to sail Blackstone into new waters. You see, the U.S. real estate market had just experienced a huge downturn. The crisis began when savings and loan associations across America, caught up in a nationwide building boom, overextended themselves with risky loans. In response to the growing problem, the federal government established the Resolution Trust Corporation in 1989. The goal was to liquidate the assets, mortgages, and properties tied to these troubled loans. But it didn't work. Because when the country entered a recession in 1990, the value of these newly constructed homes and offices plummeted. This put the RTC under intense pressure to sell these assets off quickly and at heavily discounted prices. You see where this is going yet? Schwartzman realized he could snap up these properties for a bargain and yield potentially massive returns in the future. Acting on this insight, Schwartzman partnered with Goldman Sachs to make Blackstone's very first real estate investment, Garden Apartments in Arkansas and East Texas. At the time, Schwartzman couldn't have predicted the full impact of this decision, but it was a good one, as real estate would grow to become Blackstone's largest business segment. And since its first property investment, Blackstone has cast a wide net in the real estate market. We're not just talking about a few apartments here and there. No, They've got their hands on everything from swanky hotels and sprawling office buildings to hospitals and student housing. Let's put it this way. If it's got 4 walls and a roof, chances are Blackstone has invested in it. But even while riding high on Blackstone's real estate successes, Schwartzman still wasn't content. As a new millennium dawned, he began setting his sights on the most ambitious goal to date, taking Blackstone public. Now, what does it mean to take an investment firm public? This means Blackstone would transform from a private PE firm into a publicly traded entity, opening its doors to outside investors and expanding its overall reach. For Schwartzman, a man who had faced his fair share of rejection, this move was fraught with risk. Going public meant inviting the world to scrutinize Blackstone, to hold a magnifying glass up to its inner workings, and potentially to reject it on a grand scale. The stakes were higher than even before. Schwartzman and his team poured days into drafting the final prospectus, a document that would be Blackstone's introduction to the world, detailing every aspect of the company's operations, financials, and future plans. The final draft arrived with impeccable dramatic timing, just as Schwartzman was about to enjoy a night at the theater. In the Heights was Broadway's latest hit, but for Schwartzman, the real show was in his hands, all 221 pages of it. As the show started, Schwartzman began reading the prospectus under dim lights, but eventually took to the lobby to finish. After his final read-through, he thought, "What a marvelous company! I'd buy stock in a minute." It's the night of the IPO pricing, and Schwartzman returns back to his empty Manhattan apartment. He enters relaxation mode after a long day and changes in a comfortable ensemble: jeans, a polo shirt, and slippers. The king of capital was, for a moment, just a man in need of a quiet evening. Almost on autopilot and with his TV dinner freshly microwaved, he flicked on the TV only to find himself face to face with himself. CNBC was running nonstop coverage of Blackstone's IPO. Too drained to change the channel, Schwartzman sat there, listened to experts compare his company to Google, wondering if he'd ever escape the madness. And as dawn broke on Blackstone's very first public trading day, Schwartzman made a surprising choice. Instead of heading to the stock exchange to ring the opening bell, a Wall Street tradition, he delegated the task to Pete Peterson and Tony James. Stephen Schwartzman, the man of the hour himself, chose to retreat to the quiet of his office. The usually bustling Blackstone corridors were empty as he made his way to the conference room. In solitude, Schwartzman turned on CNBC, watching as the market opened and Blackstone began its life as a public company. The coverage was relentless, interviews he couldn't remember giving, analysts dissecting every aspect of the IPO. Now, you might be wondering, why all the fuss? Well, this wasn't just any old IPO. We're talking about one of the largest and most anticipated public offerings in the US history at the time. In its market debut, Blackstone's shares had jumped an impressive 13%, and Stephen Schwartzman was the name on everyone's lips. But after an hour of watching, it all became too much. Schwartzman reached for the remote and abruptly shut off the TV. In the sudden silence, the enormity of what he had achieved and what lay ahead finally sank in. The IPO was no longer a prospect or a plan. It was reality, and Schwartzman was at the helm of a new era for Blackstone. But what would that new era look like? Well, let's rewind a bit and look at the economic landscape leading up to the IPO. You see, Blackstone was stepping onto the public stage just as the curtain was about to fall on some of the largest financial institutions in the world. In February 2007, Freddie Mac, formerly known as the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, sent shockwaves through the credit market when they announced they would stop purchasing subprime loans. But why? Well, subprime loans were the matches that lit the financial firestorm. These were mortgages handed out to folks with shaky credit, people who, on paper, looked more likely to miss payments. For years, banks had been packaging these loans into neat little bundles called mortgage-backed securities and selling them off to unsuspecting investors. Of course, this greed was only creating a housing bubble that was bound to burst. And as subprime homeowners started predictably defaulting on their loans, it marked the beginning of America's greatest recession since the Great Depression. But the real wake-up call for America came when Bear Stearns' hedge funds imploded. Suddenly, it wasn't just financial insiders who were worried. The entire country started to realize we were sliding into an economic crisis. Even the big players weren't immune. Banking giants like JP Morgan, Bank of America, and Citi, names that had seemed as solid as the vaults they guarded, were struggling to roll over commercial paper. In layman's terms, they were finding it hard to secure short-term loans to keep their daily operations running smoothly. And then came the day that would be etched in financial history, September 15, 2008. Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old institution that had survived 2 world wars and the Great Depression, filed for bankruptcy. It was like watching a financial Titanic sink, and it sent shockwaves through Wall Street and beyond. So, how did Schwartzman navigate Blackstone through these turbulent times? Well, this wasn't his first rodeo with a real estate crisis, and Schwartzman was well positioned and prepared. Sitting on $4 billion in cash from the IPO and a $1.5 billion revolving credit line, he was prepared to snatch up assets from distressed sellers for a later profit. But of course, despite his preparation, Blackstone wasn't entirely immune to the crisis. During this stressful time, their share price plummeted from $31 at IPO to a low of $3.55. To make matters worse, in the last quarter of 2008, the value of Blackstone's assets in their private equity portfolio was slashed by 20%, and their real estate down by a whopping 30%. To make matters even worse, JP Morgan slashed their credit line in half. Yet, as 2008 drew to a close, Schwartzman's instincts told him the worst had passed. On October 15th, while speaking at Munich Technical University, he was faced with a stark question: would we survive? Schwartzman boldly declared the financial crisis over and was met with gratitude and applause. But as he left the auditorium, the weight of his words hit him. In sitting in the car to the airport, Schwartzman felt sick to his stomach. He had now said it publicly, and he knew that he had better be right. Little did he know, Schwartzman's prescient handling of the crisis would garner attention from more than just other investors and banks. In 2012, Schwartzman received a phone call out of the blue, expecting a business partner or perhaps his broker. But the voice on the other end of the line tells him it's the president. Confused, Schwartzman asks, the president of what? And surprise, surprise, it's not just the president of the local golf association, it's Barack Obama, the president of the United States. Obama cuts to the chase and asks for Schwartzman's help. Turns out, even the leader of the free world sometimes needs a hand with budget negotiations. And who better to call than the man who turned 400,000 into an empire? Of course, Schwartzman agreed to help. He spent the next week communicating with other leaders and the president himself, proposing compromises about tax increases. But Schwartzman's foray into politics wouldn't just end with the Obama administration. When Trump took office, Schwartzman continued to work in the political arena. In 2018 alone, he made 8 trips to China, becoming a sort of unofficial intermediary in trade negotiations between China and the U.S.
The U.S. keeps changing its views. The Chinese keep changing their views. I've been like in the middle of this thing.
So if you had any question about how powerful you can get from running a firm like Blackstone, there's your answer: a whole lot. Fast forward to today, and Blackstone isn't just another actor on the financial stage, it's practically the star of the show. Stephen Schwartzman, the man who started it all, has seen his own fortunes rise along with the company's. His net worth has jumped to over $40 billion. He's gone from counting pennies in his father's curtain shop to counting billions in his Wall Street empire. And even after his longtime partner, Pete Peterson, stepped down, Schwartzman has continued to stay at Blackstone's helm, wearing the hats of chairman, CEO, and co-founder. Under Schwartzman's leadership, Blackstone's financial performance has been nothing short of remarkable. They manage over $1 trillion, making it the largest alternative asset manager in the entire world and earning Schwartzman the nickname the King of Capital. But for Schwartzman, it isn't all about the money. In 2013, he founded the Schwartzman Scholars Program, a move that showcases his commitment to global education and leadership. This initiative offers a select group of students the opportunity to earn a one-year master's degree in global affairs at Tsinghua University in Beijing, China. Every summer, Schwartzman makes a journey to Beijing to speak as a mentor and inspiration to the graduating class of Schwartzman scholars. For a man who's seen it all in the world of high finance, you might think commencement speeches would be old hat. But according to Stephen, speaking at the Schwartzman Scholars graduation has become one of his favorite annual traditions. It's a reminder of why he started this program in the first place, to nurture the next generation of global problem solvers. During his annual address, Schwartzman doesn't focus on balance sheets or investment strategies. Instead, he emphasizes a message that served him well throughout his career. Resilience in the face of rejection is what truly defines a person. As he presents each diploma and shakes the hands of every graduate who crosses the stage, Schwartzman can't help but wonder, what's the next act? But for a man who's overcome unimaginable obstacles, he knows the answer is both thrilling and simple. Who knows? Schwartzman may have built an empire in New York City, but our next billionaire bought the entire nation. Don't miss our reveal on America's true economic puppeteer. Watch now.